gets us to McCarthy. So you don't often have a lot of questions about McCarthyism because, again, the fact that you read the book The Crucible, which most English teachers provide you, and I know Mrs. Hollis does because of her history background, provide you with a background of what was happening when Arthur Miller wrote The Crucible. Walker, are you all right with that sun in your eyes? Okay. Okay. You guys, anytime you need to get up and close the blinds, feel free to. So you don't have a lot of questions about McCarthyism, but it is important to look at what's happening in the United States in the mid and early 50s. And it is why, and what you need to connect with McCarthyism that I would write out to the side is conformity. So what McCarthy does, and again, if we think back to the Crucible, right? The people that were picked out in that town in Salem as witches were those people that did not conform. And so that's the subplot of the Crucible is conforming, being like everyone else. Again, that was Puritans if we go all the way back to our 1620s, right? Puritans, that's not a far-fetched thing. If we go too far outside, you could get banished from the village or the common town of Salem. So McCarthy, unknown senator from Wisconsin, and what he does that elevates this McCarthyism communism is he says that the U.S. State Department is full of communists. The State Department is what recognizes the United States across the world. Those of you that enjoy politics and you want to see the world and you're good at languages, the State Department is an awesome job to be a part of. You can get posted anywhere in the world. You have to have a good knowledge of history. You have to have good knowledge of politics. And usually you have to speak a foreign language. Most often that foreign language would be Francais, which we don't offer. But those of you that are interested, it's the life of government is a really, really nice job. But he says the entire State Department, which State Department represents the country around the world, is full of communists. This inflames the world, right? It inflames the people in the United States. And he begins these hearings to ferret out all of these communists. So fears raised by the fall of China. We got all these communists running around. And so the next one, fear of the Soviet Union developing the atomic bomb in 1949. In 1949, the Soviets now have the atomic bomb same as we do. Fears raised by President Truman. Fears by the relationship of the Soviet spies, that we have spies everywhere. And so...
Pardon this interruption. Golden Arrow Singers and Senior Student Council, please report to the Commons.
I'm recording this, okay? So make sure you listen. Fears raised by the revelations that Soviet spies had infiltrated the State Department and 2 spy cases. So we have 2 real spy cases. Former State Department, Alger Hess, accused of passing secrets to the Soviets. And then the other case involved Ethel and Julius Rosenberg. They will be executed. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg executed for giving Soviet spies. So there really are spies. There are always spies. We have spies now, but we don't obviously have this heightened inflation of the Soviets. So what's his tactic? His first tactic is, I'm calling you a communist. And hopefully, as you guys discuss with the Crucible, how do you defend yourself against something like that? You can't. Once someone has labeled you, once someone has targeted you, it's really hard to prove that you're not a communist because everything you do can be turned around. No, I'm not. I'm not a communist. I wear a flag every day. Yeah, you wear a flag every day to hide you're a communist. There's nothing that you can say, nothing that you can do that then changes the mind of these people. He plays on the American fears. And then what he does is he holds these hearings. And this, again, is in the beginnings of television, where people have TV, the beginnings of live TV, where he will actually have many of these broadcast live. As a result of McCarthy's anti-communist witch hunt, millions of Americans are forced to take loyalty oaths, undergo loyalty investigations. Then on the top of page 121, and this fear of communism is going to infiltrate Hollywood. And this again will be one of the biggest parts of his tactics is getting into Hollywood where people make
Teacher,
movies.
please excuse the
Oh
interruption.
my God.
Could I please see Addison Arnold, Matthew Hensler, Courtney Ridgway, and Annalie Condon? Please come to the office.
Okay, thank you. Okay, sorry about that. So they start blacklisting. And again, these people are blacklisted because McCarthy says they're communists, not any real. And let's just really throw this out there. Is it against the law to be a communist? No. Yes. The Communist Party exists today. You can look up the Communist Party online. You can become a member of the Communist Party. We live in a democratic nation that allows you to be part of any political affiliation that you want. So this is the most important thing about this, because somewhere in this, we are going to get our first mention of this guy named Richard Nixon, and he is going to be in charge of the House of Un-American Activities. Un-American Activities. We are in trouble, Gavin. We are in trouble when we get to a part of the government that tells us what is American and what is un-American. So this is, again, what we will look at. Fall of communism. It's not until 1954 when Senator McCarthy accuses the entire United States Army. He went one step too far, which is an awesome song, One Step Beyond. He went one step beyond, accused the Army, and at that point, he falls into a downward spiral in which he will die 3 years later of chronic alcoholism. Again, the rise and fall of Senator McCarthy is key to understanding the culture of the 50s. The culture of the 50s is about conformity. If you look and act like everyone else, you won't be targeted, right? This idea, what's going to explode, and this is where we need to make the connection. So, as a 10-year-old kid, your parents are conforming. You're watching this communist. They're making you be like everyone else. Don't do this. Don't do that. Wear the same. Everybody's wearing the same clothes. When you turn 18 and you hit the University of Michigan and you are now allowed to think for yourself, that's when we explode with student movements. So these kids that are going to be the children of the 60s and 70s, this explosion of student movements, they grew up with really three things that are going to change their life: the fear of the bomb, conformity, and the idea of changing education to look like what you need for to be respectful and to be successful in the real world. This will be where students will start asking for a women's studies program, like, can we get and learn about women? So that will be the explosion that's going to happen in the 60s. Next stage is on page 122, milestones in modern civil rights movement. So this is a very frequently addressed issue on the AP exam, both as we haven't had a civil rights DBQ in a really long time. We usually always have something in the short answer. This is why we always play Rosa Parks bingo. I told you about that, right? Who gets the first one about Rosa Parks? These milestones in modern civil rights movement, the very first one when we talk about the modern civil rights movement is Harry Truman desegregating the United States military. And that is significant in the idea, as what I suggested yesterday, when the federal government does something, everyone else trickles down. So as a comparison right now, President Biden is expected in the next 2 days to issue an executive order about the minimum wage. He is about to establish for all federal employees a minimum wage of $15. It doesn't affect any of you, because unless you work for the federal government, it doesn't affect you. But what happens when presidents issue these executive orders? So he's going to issue these executive orders that anyone that works for the federal government, minimum wage is now $15. What's going to have to happen is companies or businesses or industries that compete for those jobs that are going to the federal government, they're now going to have to increase theirs to $15 an hour. So let's just take, for instance, I know we don't think about these things, but in the White House, in Congress, there is restaurants where people work as waiters, waitresses, cooks, busboys. They are federal employees. They work for the government. There is no way any of them right now are making $15 an hour. But if they bump a waitress to $15 an hour, all the restaurants in Washington, D.C. are going to have difficulty, because if I'm a waitress, where do I want to work? I want to work where I make it $15 an hour. So that's the way that works. President Truman does the same thing with the military. He desegregates the military in 1948, and eventually everything else is going to trickle down. That's the power of the executive office, and that will be what they will do. So when President Truman does that, guess what those Southern conservatives do? They walk out and they make their own new political party. Please highlight this, called the Dixiecrats. The South had really gone Democratic during FDR. And the Dixiecrats will walk out of the 1948 Democratic National Convention to demonstrate their opposition to President Truman's civil rights legislation. And they are going to spend the next 25 years working hard to prevent integration anywhere. They're Dixiecrats. And this begins with Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. So in 1954, the Supreme Court says separate but equal is unconstitutional. And it is separate but equal is unconstitutional. And what the court ruling says, with all due speed, all schools should now be integrated. With all due speed, 1954. So when I moved back to North Carolina, when my dad is doing a year isolated tour in Korea, when I'm in the fourth grade, so I'm in the fourth grade, that's 1974. In 1974, the public school system in Wayne County, guess what? Still segregated. 20 years later, still segregated. And in 1974, the county is about to lose their federal funding for any of their schools unless they integrate. So what they do is they bus. So when busing starts, and I'm sure we'll get to this in our notes, but this for me is a great place to say. When busing starts, white communities say, we're going to bus white kids, put white kids on a bus, and send them to the African American schools on the other side of town. So why would they do that? They would do that because most every place that has busing, the white kids and their parents will now form private schools. In the summer of 1974, there were 3 new private schools formed in Wayne County. Goldsboro, North Carolina Goldsboro is about the size of Terre Haute. Imagine Terre Haute with 3 private schools. 3 private schools. Why? So all the white kids can then go to the private schools. The buses can still go, and Wayne County can tell the government, hey, we bus kids that way. Can't help it if they choose to go someplace else. So that's what they did. Except for my mom. And I've told you guys this 100 times, I think. My mom said, nope. My kids, this is the school. My granny's like, I'll pay the tuition.
Interruption. Spring drama, please report to the comments.
My granny's like, no, I'll pay the tuition. I don't want my kids going over there. I don't want my grandkids going over there. My mom's like, they're going. So me, my sister, and 3 other kids got on a bus at the Goldsboro National Army on a giant yellow school bus. 5 of us kids bused to East End School, got off. 5 of us kids. I was the only white person in my class, my sister, Melissa, and one of the boys in that class. And that's how I went to 4th grade the entire year, because my mom refused. I now think it was not anything about my mom. I like to think my mom was a great champion, but I think she was just getting back at her mom, and we were the pawns. That's truly what I think now. My mom really was I know she was a little bit, because remember I told you she wouldn't let us eat table grapes because we were protesting table grapes for migrant workers in California in the 1960s. So I know my mom had a little bit, but I'm quite certain. So that that was 1974. Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. 20 years. Wayne County not integrated. The high school that I graduated from in 1982 was the first school to go integrated K through 12. And the reason that the county schools were able to do that quicker was there was not a way to put public or private schools out in the county. So the county integrated in 1968. When I started kindergarten, I didn't start with them. So this is the idea of what we're dealing with. The bottom of that page, President Eisenhower sends federal troops to Little Rock when these schools are desegregated to enforce court desegregation. And there'll be, is it Little Rock 6 or Little Rock 8? I can't remember how many. Ruby Bridges is going to do the same thing as a first grader in Louisiana with adults screaming in her face. And we'll watch a little bit of this on Friday. Eisenhower supported his decision by saying the very basis of our individual rights and freedoms rest upon the certainty of the president and the executive branch that will support and ensure the carrying out of decisions of the federal courts. 100% opposite from Andrew Jackson, right? Who said, hey, court, you can say all you want, but I'm going to do what I want. Eisenhower, 180 switch of how we viewed the judicial system, right? Eisenhower says, this is what the court said. This is what I must do. Although he didn't send troops to Little Rock, Eisenhower, not a vigorous supporter of civil rights legislation, as many people are, but he is following the law. Martin Luther King will come next. Dr. King, his goal was integrated in all races through society. Please underline nonviolent pressure. So remember, I've talked about this many times. Every movement always starts nonviolently. At some point, it has to change tactics because nonviolence, sadly, for the most part, really doesn't have a lot of change that it can do. It's sad in our history, but it always has been some type of violence. Remember back to the American Revolution when I talked about that. I said we're going to start this revolution on two tracks. We're going to start on a legislative track. We're going to do things on paper. We're going to sign petitions. We're going to do all of these things, and then we get to a stop where it stops. Violent interaction means dumping tea, tar and feathering, boycotting. Boycotting isn't a violent action, but it's an action. So those are the things that have to happen in order for that to change. So Martin Luther King is working through both the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and nonviolence. On the top of the next page, the sit-in movement. Students are going to stage sit-ins at a lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960 to protest segregation in public facilities. So think like the newsstand. So if we could pick up the newsstand and plop it in Walmart, that's what those lunch counters were like. So what the heck was the name of it? What was it? Woolworths. At Woolworths, we had a little corner Woolworths store, and every Saturday morning, my mom would do her little regular shopping because back in the day, grocery stores only had food, so you had to go to two spots, right, to buy deodorant and soap and toothpaste. That was not in a grocery store. Only food was in a grocery store. So every Saturday morning, Mom would go to Woolworths, do that shopping, and then she would plop me and my sister and order us a grilled cheese, fries, and milkshake, and we'd sit there and eat while my mom shopped. All of that. So what happens is four African-American students go sit at that counter to be served. They're not going to be served. What happens to those four students in the period of about 30 minutes is, again, these are college students. Other grown adults are going to pour ketchup on their head, dump sugar on their head, spit on them, dump their Coke, water, all over them. Adults. Because these four African-American college students dressed in suits, sitting there trying to order something to eat. And again, we'll watch this because I think it's important for you to see how and what this group of people were up against from other adults. It's kind of mind-boggling. So this is an example of nonviolent civil disobedience. So we're going to pause there. And now we're going to look at prosperity and change. Because what's going to happen is that movement is paused. Like they're going to continue doing sit-ins. They're going to continue marching. They're going to continue the Children's March, all nonviolently. So now we're going to pause and do prosperity and change. The 1950s and 60s is known as the affluent society. Affluent means wealthy, right? Everybody's affluent. The decade after World War II was characterized by the following: unprecedented prosperity, a population explosion known as the baby boom, and rapid and extensive suburbanization. So let's go by suburbanization. Suburbs. One of the reasons those suburbs are full, it's called white flight. Because as white people are becoming affluent, so are African Americans, and they are starting to move into neighborhoods. And so what happens is white people all leave the cities and move to these suburbs, which leaves the inner cities with mostly left African Americans. Women, following World War II, large numbers of women left their industrial jobs to go back home. Rosie the Riveter gave up her tools, returned home. Housewife, please underline this, the housewife became the new ideal for the married woman. Girls will go to college to get married. Their sole purpose. Why are you going to college? To get married. And if I'm not married by my sophomore year, I am an utter failure. That is the whole goal for women in college. Women pick their colleges based on the type of man they want to marry. You want to marry a lawyer? You need to go to a school that has a lot of males going into law school. You want to marry a doctor? You need to go. You're not picking a school based on what you want to learn or what you hope to be. It's where your prospective husband might be going. Television will perpetuate this ideal. I Love Lucy, Father Knows Best, Honeymooners, all women in their roles as loyal, subservient housewives. They all have allowances. Here's your allowance. Can I have this? Do you have money left in your allowance? No. Can I do this? Second, interstate highways. Interstate highways, let's draw a line out because they're not telling you why. Interstate highways are built during the Cold War for the purpose of being able to launch atomic bombs. That is why they're in the middle of nowhere. That's why they're 4 lanes. It is to move military equipment. So if you think about where interstates are in our brain now, it's outside of towns and cities to get away from the traffic. But the intent was to provide a way to move mass military quickly and to be able to launch surface-to-air missiles, atomic bombs, any of those things. So I always laugh at the highway system. Yeah, cool. Places for the military to march and light off bombs. Federal Highway Act vastly accelerated the growth of suburbia and promoted the car culture. Social critics, and those social critics are critics of conformity. Conform. Look like everybody else, look like everybody else. And we will have quite a few of those. Critics lambasted popular TV shows, calling them the new medium, and a vast wasteland. It's just the same show over and over. Our nonconformists are going to start in this time period. Jack Harnack and the Beat Generation. So the Beat Generation are not hippies. Beat Generation would be hipsters, if that's still a thing. But everybody knows what a hipster is. Hipster/emo. That's Beat. Dark, deep thoughts. Their music is all different. Their poetry is different. Little bird pecking your beak on the window. There's no bread for you today. That's the Beats. They're cool. They're the first group non-conforming. That was my poetry slam for the day. I just made that up at the top of my head. This is the Beat. See what you missed, sleeping, Gavin? Anyway. No. So, this is the Beats. They're not hippies. They're hipsters. They wear berets, black, drinking coffee without anything in it, and purposefully looking different. And that's Jack Harnack on the road, Ginsburg, Howe, all these weird kind of, I shouldn't say weird, all these attempts to be weird and different on purpose. 1920s and 50s were similar. Both followed devastating world wars. Both featured anti-communists. Both had a lost generation. So the lost generation of the 20s are the Beats. We now get to our cultural rebels. So again, every generation tries to rebel from what the previous generation, right? So the 40s was big band, Sinatra, and now we're going to move into rock and roll. Rock and roll is the one culturally exclusive American identity, right? This is our one thing that's just ours, no one else's. It's going to emerge in the 1950s, and most of it's going to be by African Americans. Rock and roll was first called race music because it sounded black. Many people, the first time they see people like Elvis Presley, are amazed that he's white because they think he's black. So this race music, rock and roll, was not played on white radio stations first. It's played on African American stations first. Inspired by African American Elvis Presley. I hope all of you know the King, who died prematurely before I had a chance to marry him, because that was the goal of my life, to marry Elvis Presley. We have abstract artists and then movie stars. And our movie stars are going to be those silent types like James Dean, Marlon Brando, Rebel Without a Cause, The Wild Bunch. The whole movie of The Wild Bunch is this motorcycle gang rolls into a town and terrorizes it for a whole weekend. That was like top box office movie with Marlon Brando playing the leather jacketed, silent, deep thinking motorcycle gang who falls in love with the cute little girl serving the coffee at the diner. It's a great movie. So is Rebel Without a Cause. Rebel Without a Cause is the same thing. It's all these teenagers who are now living in a world where everybody can die in 30 minutes. Why do I have to be like everybody else? Why must I be like everybody else? And their whole life is geared around these very dangerous things that they do. Rebel Without a Cause is a fantastic movie. It is in color. I highly encourage. Have you seen it?
Yeah.
It's awesome, isn't it? It's a great, great movie. Did you watch it with your dad?
No, I thought so.
It's an awesome movie. And if you have the chance to see The Wild Bunch is in black and white, but again, same kind of movie. So that takes us through the 50s, where we're slowly starting, especially the younger group, to try to make themselves and form their own identity. Then we get to the 60s. And make sure that you see these two things, the New Frontier and Great Society. The New Frontier and Great Society, New Frontier is space. Great Society is the New Deal for poor people. So this is a great compare and contrast. The New Deal of the 30s, the Great Society of the 1960s. They're both about reforming and changing governments. The Great Society is about helping poor people. Right? So when we talk about this great affluent society, it's affecting a lot of people, but I would feel fairly certain that there would be a whole lot of people in rural Indiana that it didn't affect. And I know personally it did not affect a family in Wayne County, North Carolina, because they were not affluent. Because my granny and papa did not get a bathroom inside of their house until 1973. 1973, before they got a bathroom inside of their house. So, election of 1960, John F. Kennedy, first Roman Catholic. That is, again, incredibly significant because we have passed through those inherent discriminatory views of Catholicism. However, JFK did have to go on TV and say, I will not take orders from the Pope. He had to say that out loud. And I have mentioned this a lot. It is the only Democrat that my granny never voted for, ever. And she told me that. I knew that from forever. I didn't even know what a Democrat was. I certainly didn't know what a Roman Catholic was, but I knew she didn't like them. And President Biden is only our second Roman Catholic president of a religion that is the most well represented in our country. The fact that we've only had two. presidents is astounding. And for those of you that watch anything on TV in regards to politics or any kind of ceremonies, like for instance, sad ceremonies in our last couple of months of people lying in state, like the officer that died from what happened January 6th, and then the officer that just died from the attack where he got run over by someone trying to enter into the restricted space around the White House and and Congress. If you watch that, especially if you are Catholic, I think you'd be surprised at how many people are crossing themselves, right? Congress is represented by a whole lot of Catholic people. And why? Because they come from those districts where there are a lot of Catholic people. But this will be a very important election for the 1960s. We get a really, really handsome guy, which historians and political historians say that's probably why, one of the largest reasons. It is the first broadcast debate on TV between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon has a 5 o'clock shadow. He is sweating profusely. This is the important part. For people who listen to the debate on the radio, overwhelmingly they said Nixon won. Nixon won. For people who watched on TV, they overwhelmingly said John F. Kennedy won. And that's the power of beauty in politics. It's power of beauty in politics. And that happens. So 1960s, first to include televised debates. 60 million people are watching that. JFK is the youngest elected president. Remember that. His new frontier in the 1960s, he has this lovely, glamorous wife named Jacqueline. They nicknamed their presidency Camelot. In his inaugural address, ask not what your country can do for you, ask not what your country can do for you, what you can do for your country. He is, of course, going to be assassinated November 22nd, 1963. Lee Harvey Oswald's going to be shot 2 days later on live TV. Live TV, he gets shot by Jack Ruby, which then gets this whole conspiracy thing that we're not going to talk about. Most important that we're going to end our day on is Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ. LBJ is a good old Texas boy. What makes LBJ different from other Southerners serving in politics is that he was a teacher. Go Johnson. And he was a teacher of minorities. He taught in schools in Texas that were low income, a large minority population, and in Texas at that time, that large minority population was Hispanic, and developed this different opinion of the way that the United States should govern itself. So, Great Society. Use federal government to enhance social welfare. Use education. Why? Because he's a teacher. Job training to help disadvantaged people. Why? Because he saw it. He saw that as a teacher. To overcome the cycle of poverty. How do you help people get out of poverty? At some point, there has to be some kind of hand up to help people get out of poverty. Lyndon Baines Johnson passes the most civil rights agenda policies of anyone at this point. Civil Rights Act of 1964. And I want you to know that's the year I was born, right? Here I sit, not slowly, all the way decrepit, a little achy sometimes, but not that old. Civil Rights Act of 1964 was the first Civil Rights Act that guaranteed African Americans their place at the poll. Without a grandfather clause, without a literacy test, without a poll tax, without any other ways to restrict their right to vote, the year that I was born. Voting Rights Act of 1965, which does away with all those other things. Medicare and Medicaid. War on poverty. Head Start. If any of you went to Head Start, Lyndon Baines Johnson starts that. Similarities between New Deal and Great Society. So this was a comparison. Both use the government to enhance social welfare. Both the New Deal and the Great Society included all of the following: government-sponsored employment, federal programs, federal legislation. The difference between New Deal and Great Society is New Deal was when we were in a Great Depression. Great society is when we are in an economic explosion, right? We are exploding. Federal government encouraged housing. In contrast to New Deal, Great Society included federal legislation protecting civil liberties of African Americans. Okay? All right. So tomorrow I will quick lecture on the 60s, civil rights movement. All right. So homework. Ooh, you thought I was going to forget that. What did I do with it? No.
Is it due Thursday?
It's yours. It's due Thursday. What? No, actually, this is due Friday. Because there's 2 of them.
Oh, no.
So this is due Friday. This is our last. So use all those techniques you just learned at the stress. Squeeze people's shoulders. No, I don't. This is it. It's Friday. This is due Friday.
Are you kidding me? Hold on. You can't be serious.
Huh?
1, 2, 3.
It's not that much.
Are you? It's not that much.
I'm sorry. I hope you know the page number.
Oh my goodness.
Bill 15 pages.
Use your study hall, people.
Actually, 16, 17.
Use your study hall.
Let's go ahead.
Friday.
Oh, get started. I got this. Is there any yellow paper for this?
No, there is not. No. This is it for this week. Next week we'll start our look at. All right, so the periodization is the same. So this one is concept. So what you're looking at here, first and foremost, none of these have to be complete sentences. Give me an example. So I give you examples, collective security, the United Nations, Truman Doctrine, Marshall Plan. So as post-war tensions dissolved, the wartime alliances between Western democracies and Soviet Union developed foreign policy based on collective security. So I would put NATO, description, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, 10 countries join as collective security. Significance to the thesis, the NATO was used to prevent aggression from the Soviet Union. But this, okay? All right. On the lecture tomorrow, there probably will be a quick question, not long, just so that I know that you've watched, because it is important. That will be the civil rights movement and moving into the 60s. And then on Thursday, we'll watch a few quick minutes of the civil rights movement, some of the, in particular, the violent parts of the civil rights movement and how all that played out. All right, let me take attendance and stop this recording.